Have you ever been on a flight that's been diverted? Diversions are a pretty common occurrence in aviation. Medical emergencies, mechanical issues, volcanic ash, or weather can all send an aircraft somewhere unexpected. And they happen every single day, whether we like it or not. Some diversions are simple and straightforward. A quick medical offload, a refuel, and then back on your way. Others, though, can throw plans into complete chaos, leaving crew and passengers misplaced for days while the underlying issue is resolved. Today's story is one of those diversions, but it came with a problem that we hadn't really considered before. You see, when a flight diverts, responsibility is quickly divided. Ground agents take care of the passengers and hotels, and operations take care of the crew and the next steps. Systems click into place and the machine just keeps on moving. But what if you're an unaccompanied minor? Who takes responsibility for a child travelling alone when there is no adult waiting at the new destination? Well, as we discovered when this story was sent to us, that responsibility falls squarely at the feet of the crew. And by the end of this episode, we think you'll agree they did an outstanding job of turning one little girl's unexpected diversion into a journey she would remember for the rest of her life.
Doors to armed and cross-check.
Come fly the red eye!
Welcome aboard the Red Eye.
Christmas travel plans for thousands of families are in disarray tonight as heavy snow shuts down London's busiest airport, with officials warning of further disruption in the days to come. We're seeing scenes of stranded passengers sleeping on terminal floors and temporary marquees being set up outside of terminal buildings, while incoming flights are being diverted and nothing is taking off. Travellers are being strongly advised to stay at home and not to come to the airport.
Ghana to London, 1600 Zulu, December 19th, 2010. Paris, can you repeat that? Both pilots leaned in closer to the radio, both hoping they had misheard.
Captain, I repeat, are you aware that London Heathrow is closed and no UK airfields are accepting diversions? Over.
Captain Dave Turnham looked across at his first officer. He had been prepared for the worst. Taken on extra fuel in Ghana in case they needed to hold or divert north to Manchester perhaps. But at the point that they had taken off just a few hours ago, the snow was just minimal and looked to be staying that way. Now, though, it seemed that had changed. Paris, request right turn 180 degrees. I'll get back to you with my intentions in 10 minutes. He nodded at Simon, the first officer. You have control, mate. The controller gave the go-ahead, and as Simon steered the plane away from the UK, away from where they'd been going, Dave looked back at the snow-covered ground which had been ahead of them and let out a low sigh. What on earth was he going to do? And how long did he have to decide before anyone in the cabin noticed that they had just changed course and started asking questions? He thought quickly, using the brain that had been primed for making split-second decisions in the military, flicking through his options on mental flashcards. He considered distance, facilities, even political climates, until one card stood out that ticked all of his boxes. Dave put on his headset and pressed the button for Ops. Ops, this is the 377. My intention is to go to Palma, Mallorca, unless you have an alternative. The reply came as a question.
Do you have enough fuel for that, Captain?
Yes, sir. We took on extra in Ghana, just in case.
Then that's great. Request approved. Palmer for you it is.
Dave could hear the relief in the voice of the operations controller as he crossed one problem off his list. No doubt there was a whole stream of company planes lined up in the same queue of doom right now, captains deciding where best to go, but not them. They were off to Mallorca, where the tower had said they were welcome. And if the layover was extended for more than a few hours, you might even get to visit a beach bar. In a sky full of clouds, Dave had always believed in picking one with a silver lining. Now he just needed to let everyone else know the plan. "Manager to flight deck," he said over the PA. The flight's manager, Louise, was standing in the galley just outside the flight deck, helping to clear away the last of the meal service. They had all felt the plane turning, and something told her she was about to find out why. She punched in the access code on the panel, and the light turned green as the door unlocked. "You called?" she said as she stepped inside and pulled the door closed behind her. Dave briefed her quickly, and she repeated it back. "So, we're diverting to Palma, Mallorca in 90 minutes due to weather conditions." Dave nodded. "Any medicals or special requirements that might be a problem?" Louise thought for a moment, trying to remember what special assistance paperwork she'd signed just before departure. Just a couple of wheelchairs," she said. "Oh, and I have a 6-year-old unaccompanied minor travelling on a Ghanaian passport." Dave took a deep breath. "Well, hopefully we won't need to be on the ground for too long," he said, his mind already lining up the problems they might face if they were. They had a few hours to play with before the crew went out of hours, before they had to find out whether their Ghanaian passport holders were even allowed off the plane. And as for an unaccompanied minor, well, he shook his head. No, we didn't need to worry about that. Not yet, anyway. "I'll brief the passengers in a few minutes, if you can let the crew know first." Louise stood at the open aircraft door and breathed in the warm air drifting across the ramp. A set of steps had been positioned, but so far only airport staff had used them to come and go, and no one appeared to be making any actual decisions. Beyond them, other misplaced aircraft were beginning to line up, a few bearing the familiar livery of their own airline. She checked her watch and felt a wash of resignation. They were definitely not going anywhere this evening. The crew were finally out of hours, and she could only hope that somewhere in the quiet between phone calls, someone was making a plan for them all. Her gaze drifted to where her unaccompanied minor sat, her angelic face calm and unreadable as she watched a film on the screen in front of her. She had seemed to understand when Louise told her they were delayed, and she didn't appear worried in the slightest, but why would she be? Worrying and planning were grown-up jobs, not the concern of a 6-year-old. Behind her, the het-up immigration official, whose day had clearly been ruined by their arrival, hung up yet another call on his phone and shook his head. "So?" Louise said, turning to face him. "Are you going to let them off?" Since stepping onto the aircraft, all he had done was make argumentative phone calls in Spanish and list the many problems the extra arrivals were causing. She had listened patiently enough, but she didn't care that the Ghanaians on board needed visas for Spain. That wasn't her problem. What she needed to know was what he was actually going to do about it. He shrugged, and Louise felt her pulse rise. "Surely somebody has to see some sense here," she demanded, unnaturally aggressive even to her own ears. The rise in her voice seemed to unsettle him, and he leaned back slightly as she continued. "Can't you call a manager? Someone must be able to make a decision. You can't just leave us all on here for days, you know. We have rights and—" But before she could decide exactly which threats to make good on, his phone rang, and she could see the relief on his face as he answered it, stopping her mid-rant. And just like that, it seemed someone had seen sense. Someone, somewhere in an office deep inside the airport, had made the right call, and the standoff was over. There were no white flags, no surrender, no celebration, just a curt instruction as he hung up the call for the passengers to disembark, and a message from Ops shortly after confirming they were heading to a hotel. And the unaccompanied minor? Awusi Ababio? Well, apparently she was to go with them, under Louise's care. As the last passenger left through the open aircraft door, Louise paused, suddenly acutely aware of her new responsibility. Now alone in the cabin, the little girl looked impossibly small and vulnerable, her eyes wide and alert as she scanned her surroundings, clearly waiting for someone to explain what was happening. Louise felt the weight of it as she sat down beside her and gently took her small hand in her own. "Shall we call your mother?" she asked, not waiting for an answer before dialing the number from the paperwork.
Hello?
Oh, hello, Mrs. Ababio. My name is Louise, and I'm calling from your daughter's flight. She heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line.
Oh, thank God. Is she okay? When will the flight arrive? I've been at the airport for hours now and I've heard nothing.
The panic in the woman's voice cut straight through the phone line, and Louise felt suddenly awful that she hadn't called sooner. She hadn't thought to. She had wrongly assumed that with something so precious as a child travelling alone, someone else would have taken care of it. "Mrs. Ababio," she asked gently, "did the airline not contact you?"
No, I have heard nothing.
Her voice was frantic, and Louise found herself imagining what it must feel like, waiting for your child on a flight that never arrives. "I am so sorry," Louise said, apologising on behalf of an airline that should have done better. "Awusi is with us now. We've had to divert to Mallorca because of the snow, and we will be staying here overnight. I will look after her like my own child, Mrs. Ababio. I promise. I'll pass you over to her now." Her voice caught as she handed the phone to the little girl and watched her dissolve into tears, sobbing quietly down the line to her mother. Louise tried to imagine it, being so young in a strange country, surrounded by unfamiliar faces, with no one you know. All this little girl wanted was her mum. At home, her own son, almost the same age, would be asleep in his own bed, watched over by his father, ready to wake up to a life that felt safe and familiar. It was a parent's duty to make a child feel safe. And while this child was not her own, Louise was a parent all the same. And she would make sure that Awusi felt safe and happy, whatever unexpected adventure lay ahead. At the hotel, Dave handed Louise the key he had just been given at the front desk. "I think you should have this," he said with a grin. "The penthouse suite. You've got 2 bedrooms and a living room, apparently. A bedroom each for you and Awusi, and we can use the lounge for a briefing in the morning, if that's okay with you." Louise didn't hesitate. She took the key and turned to smile at her charge. She had made a promise to her mother, said that she'd keep her safe and happy, and she was determined to follow that through. Starting, she decided, with a good pamper in the penthouse suite. "Awusi," Louise called the girl's name and waved the key at her. "Me and you are getting the best room," she said as she walked over, picking up both of their cases. The young girl just looked at her blankly. She still hadn't smiled, or spoken really, and Louise wasn't even sure that she understood her. But that was okay. She was going to keep on talking to her anyway. They rode the elevator up to the top floor, the quiet hum of it filling the space between them. On the top floor, Louise held the key against the lock, pushing the door open once it clicked. She signalled for Awusi to go in first and stood back, watching as the girl's expression shifted from wary to wide-eyed wonder at the sight of the opulent sofas and polished walnut cabinets. She dropped the cases and walked over to a closed door, pushing it open to see the queen-size bed behind, and beckoned Awusi over to see it. "This is your room." The young girl's eyes widened as she took it all in.
All for me?
Louise nodded. and then walked back across to the ensuite. "And this is your bathroom." Owusi stepped in beside her and peered around the tiled room. Her eyes moved from the toilet to the shower before finally settling on the bathtub. She frowned slightly.
"What is that?"
she asked quietly. Louise followed her gaze and smiled. Of course, she thought. How strange this must all look to a young African girl who'd probably never stayed in a hotel, let alone in a suite like this. She leaned over, put the plug in, and turned on the taps, and added a generous squeeze of bubbles to the running water. "This, my dear girl, is a bathtub," she said. "And all children love bubble baths." Owusi gave a small nod and watched intently as the tub filled. "Would you like to get in?" Louise asked when it was almost full. "It's a bit like swimming." Owusi nodded again, pulled her dress over her head, and, still in her underwear, carefully climbed into the frothy water. A huge smile spread across her face, and as she sat down and the bubbles burst into the air, a glorious sound escaped her. Owusi laughed. She laughed from deep in her belly, pure and unrestrained, and her joy was utterly contagious. Louise found herself laughing too, caught up in the moment. Eventually, needing to make a call home, Louise stood and stepped away. "Call me when you want to get out," she said gently. Owusi didn't respond. She was far too busy clapping her hands and watching the bubbles fly, laughing and revelling in what was quite clearly her very first bubble bath. And as Louise waited patiently nearby, it soon became clear that it would be a long while yet before Owusi was ready to get out. In fact, it would be close to 3 hours. The next morning, the entire crew, Owusi included, gathered in the living room of the suite. Dave stood by the window, hands tucked into his pockets, waiting patiently for the low hum of chatter to fade before clearing his throat. "It's official," he said at last. "We're not going anywhere today." A collective groan rippled through the room, followed almost immediately by relieved laughter. Dave raised a hand before anyone could interrupt. "After a spirited discussion with the tight-fisted office bods," he continued dryly, "who felt the allowance that you were given in Ghana should somehow also stretch to Mallorca, I've managed to negotiate something a little bit more realistic." Well, that earned him a small round of applause. He reached into his jacket and began handing out envelopes of cash. "No one is starving on my watch," he said. "I'll book a table for dinner on the beach somewhere. Meet in the lobby at 7. Until then, enjoy yourselves." Louise glanced over at Owusi, who was curled contentedly into an armchair, wrapped in an adult-sized hotel dressing gown. The sleeves dangled past her hands and the hem pooled around her ankles, but she looked entirely at home, chin tucked against the soft fabric, eyes half closed in quiet comfort. She was sure they could find something fun to do for the day, but there was one small problem. She had nothing decent to wear. She had hoped that Owusi's luggage might arrive overnight, but it clearly hadn't. Somehow it must have followed the other passengers to wherever they'd been sent, leaving the girl with only the clothes she'd travelled in. And they were now marked with food stains and the evidence of a long, exhausting journey. "Owusi," Louise said gently, approaching her. The girl looked up, her face brightening immediately as though she sensed something good was coming. "I think," Louise continued, "we should go shopping. Get you some new clothes." Well, Owusi was out of the chair before the sentence was even finished, darting toward her bedroom with a burst of energy that made the crew laugh. "Oh, we'll come too," one of the girls said. And by the time Owusi had reappeared, back in her soiled outfit, she had acquired a small army of personal shoppers, ready and eager. They made their way down into the local town together, soaking up the unfamiliar sounds and smells of the Spanish island. They wandered through the market on the main street, stopping to browse handmade jewellery, postcards and brightly coloured scarves. Owusi's eyes darted everywhere, drinking it all in. And then she stopped abruptly.
Oh, that dress!
She tugged at Louise's arm and pointed. Hanging from the stall beside them were rows of flamenco dresses. Red and black, layered with ruffles, bold and dramatic. Louise smiled despite herself and pulled one free, holding it up against Owusi's small frame. "Oh, well, I think you would look beautiful in this," she admitted. "But perhaps we should find something a bit more practical." Owusi grinned, shook her head firmly and clutched the dress to her chest.
"No,
She said with cheerful defiance.
I like this one."
Louise sighed softly, shaking her head as she gently prized it from her grasp and carefully rehung it. "My dear girl," she apologised, "you are very hard to say no to, but I have to be sensible. I'm so sorry." She tried to ignore the large brown eyes fixed on her and the uncomfortable guilt curling in her stomach. Owusi needed something she could fly home in, something practical, appropriate, and easy to justify on expenses. As much as it tugged at her heart, sending the young girl she was responsible for home in a frilly flamenco dress, looking like a Spanish drag queen, simply wouldn't do. Even if it would have made her very happy indeed. That evening, Owusi sat proudly at the head of the table in the restaurant, resplendent in her red and black flamenco dress. The frilled layers spilled over her small knees, gathering in soft folds, while the matching polka dot shoes, slightly too big, swung from her feet as she kicked them gently beneath the table. A single flower was tucked into the smooth bun at the back of her head, a splash of colour against her beautiful dark skin. She looked radiant, her chin lifted with quiet pride, her smile lighting up the entire table and refusing to leave her face for a second. Around her, the crew had fully leaned into the moment, all of them wearing matching T-shirts boldly declaring their love for the island. Captain Dave sat at Owusi's side, carefully folding paper napkins into increasingly elaborate shapes. A swan became a flower, then something that might have been a boat, each creation greeted with wide-eyed wonder and peals of laughter. Soon, the whole table was littered with paper sculptures, the crew laughing just as hard as Owusi herself, the worries of diversions and duty times momentarily forgotten. The following morning came too quickly. And so did the call to say that Owusi was flying home on the first flight out with a different crew. In the soft light of the hotel lobby, Louise knelt to hug her tightly as she handed her over to the manager who would take her home. Owusi was dressed in her old clothes now, freshly washed, but she clutched the flamenco dress carefully in a bag like precious cargo. Louise felt an unexpected tug of sadness as she stood and watched her go, waving until she disappeared through the doors. Their own crew were bound for Dubai, tasked with collecting passengers who were stranded there, and the rhythm of work soon resumed. But as they arrived in the heat and bustle of the airport, Louise found her thoughts drifting back to her young charge. Had Owusi arrived safely? Was she back with her mother now? Knowing better than to wait for an official update, Louise reached for her phone and dialed the number she had saved. Mrs. Ababio, it's Louise. I was just calling to check that Owusi arrived safely. On the other end of the line came a sound Louise couldn't quite place. Was it a laugh? A cry? Is everything all right, Mrs. Ababio? She asked, her stomach tightening.
Yes, my dear.
The woman replied heartily.
But what have you done to my daughter?
Louise's heart dropped. Had something happened? Was she unwell? She hesitated before asking, Is she okay?
Oh, yes. She's more than okay.
Mrs. Ababio laughed.
But now she wants to come back to you all. She said she had such a wonderful time. She didn't miss me at all. And apparently we now need a very big bed and a bath. She is spoiled. And as for that dress, she won't take it off.
Her laughter rang down the line, wrapping Louise like a warm embrace. In 20 years of flying, Louise had never felt so touched, so needed by a passenger as she had by that little girl. Never had a diversion, a delay, or an unexpected night away left such a lasting mark on her. She knew she would never forget little Owusi Ababio. And she had a feeling that deep down, Owusi would never forget her time with the crew either.
The Red Eye podcast is written by Kaylee Kay, narrated and produced by me, Ali Murphy. These stories are based on true events, but certain details, characters, and timelines have been altered to protect the innocent. Visit our website, theredeyepod.com, to subscribe to our newsletter and to find out details on how you can contribute your story for us to turn into an episode. If you enjoyed listening to our stories, please like, subscribe, and review. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Red Eye podcast. You guys are why we do this. We love the stories that you have, and we love telling you the stories that people share with us. To help us reach more people and get the podcast really out there, we would really appreciate it if you left a review. It just helps our podcast be a little bit more visible. Thank you.